Welcome to another deep dive here on the 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu. And today we're going to be looking at something that I think is very relevant to a lot of us,
Absolutely.
which is this idea of rapid skill acquisition.
Yeah.
We've all got busy lives.
Yeah.
You know, we're working, we've got families, we've got other commitments,
Right.
but we all want to be learning and improving all the time.
Yeah.
So how do we kind of square that circle?
Well, Anil Nathu, in his 1 hour guide, The Science of Rapid Skill Acquisition, he tries to lay out a bit of a roadmap for us there.
Okay.
And one of the things that he kicks off with is, the importance of strategy, even before we get into any particular technique or habit or practice regimen, right? You've got to be strategic about what it is you're actually setting out to learn in the first place.
Right. It's not just about picking up whatever skill is trendy or whatever everybody else seems to be doing. It's got to be a little bit more thought put into it.
Yeah. Have you ever had that experience where you kind of dove into a skill that you thought would be good for you,
Oh, yeah.
but it turned out to be a complete mismatch?
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember, I think it was probably about 5 years ago. I really thought that graphic design was going to be like my path to, being able to work from anywhere and having all this freedom and flexibility.
Yeah.
And I think I spent about 6 months banging my head against the wall,
Really?
realizing I have absolutely zero artistic talent.
Oh, no.
So that was time that could have better spent elsewhere.
Right. And that's where I think this idea of compound utility that Anil Nathu talks about comes into play, right?
Okay, so break that down for me a little bit.
So compound utility in context of a skill is, are there benefits that go beyond the immediate application of that skill?
Okay.
So like the example you were just giving with graphic design, maybe you don't become a world-class designer, but are there elements of that skill that then pay off in other areas of your life or work?
Yeah, I could see that.
So for a more practical example, a lot of people these days are thinking about getting into coding, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And coding is a great example because
Yeah.
even if you don't become a professional developer, the problem-solving skills, the logical thinking, the attention to detail that you develop through coding, that stuff is valuable in almost any field, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just about, can I build an app? It's like, am I changing the way I think?
That's such a good point. So it's almost like a meta skill, right?
Yeah.
It's a skill that then improves all your other skills.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that's a great starting point, right? Like, be more strategic about what you're even trying to learn in the first place.
Right.
But, okay, let's say we've identified that skill. We know it's got that compound utility. We're excited about it. What's next?
Well, I think this is where the 1 hour guide's focus on the stages of learning becomes really important.
Okay.
Because if you don't understand those stages, you're going to get discouraged really easily.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Because there's that initial phase where you're basically clueless, you don't even know what you don't know.
You don't even know what you don't know. Yeah. And that can be a really frustrating place to be. And I think it's easy to give up at that point.
Absolutely. Especially when you see, people on YouTube or whatever, just effortlessly doing the thing that you're struggling to even grasp the basics of.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember, as Nathu points out, that everyone goes through these stages. There's no skipping them.
Yeah.
So you start with that unconscious incompetence, then you move into, conscious incompetence where you at least know how much you don't know. And then you start to develop that conscious competence where you can do the thing, but it takes a lot of effort.
Right. Yeah. That's like when you're learning to drive stick shift, like you can do it.
Exactly.
But you're stalling out every other light.
Yeah, you're sweating, you're thinking about every single movement.
Right.
And then finally you reach that unconscious competence where the skill feels almost automatic, right?
That's the dream.
It's the dream.
But it's a process to get there.
It is a process.
And it's probably going to take longer than you want it to.
Yeah. And I think that's where we come to this, kind of impatience of the modern world.
Yeah.
We want everything right now.
Right.
We want it to be able to download the skill matrix style.
Yeah, plug it into our brains.
Yeah, exactly. But it doesn't work that way.
No.
And that's where I think having a little bit more realistic expectations from the outset is so important.
Yeah, so understanding that there are these stages.
Yeah.
And just being patient with yourself.
Yeah.
And understanding that you were gonna
Right.
struggle in those early stages.
Absolutely. And it doesn't mean you're not cut out for it. It just means you're in the process of learning.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good point.
And I think that's where, this idea of strategic planning that Nathu talks about also comes into play.
Well, let's talk about that, because that was something that jumped out at me when I was reading the 1 Hour Guide
Yeah.
is this idea of, okay, you can't just kind of randomly practice and hope for the best.
Right.
You got to have some kind of plan, some kind of structure.
Exactly. And one of the tools he suggests using is the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule.
Okay, break that down for me.
Yeah, so the 80-20 rule essentially says that 80% of the results you get come from 20% of the effort you put in.
Okay.
So the key then becomes, well, how do we identify that 20%?
Right.
Which 20% of this skill is going to give me the biggest bang for my buck.
Yeah, so if we were to kind of take a hypothetical example here, let's say, I don't know, let's say someone wants to get better at public speaking.
Okay, yeah.
So are we talking about, okay, instead of trying to, become Winston Churchill overnight,
Right.
what are those, like, 2 or 3 key things that someone should focus on in those early stages?
Yeah, so I think with public speaking, nailing down a strong opening and closing, really mastering a few key storytelling techniques, and then working on your voice projection so you can be heard.
Yeah.
Those 3 things are going to get you so much further, so much faster than trying to master every single nuance of body language and vocal tonality and
all the fancy rhetoric and everything.
all that stuff. Yeah.
Okay, that's such a good point.
And it's amazing how much progress you can make when you just focus on that vital few.
Yeah.
Rather than getting bogged down in all the minutia.
So it's kind of like, it's almost like a triage situation.
Yeah.
Like, what are the absolute essentials here that are going to,
Exactly.
keep this person alive
Yeah.
in the public speaking world?
And I think that's a great analogy. And I think that applies to so many skills, whether it's playing an instrument or learning a language or, whatever it might be. There's always those core principles, those core techniques that are going to get you 80% of the way there.
Okay, so we've identified the skill. We've kind of triaged it.
Right.
We know what that core 20% looks like.
Right.
Now we've actually got to get down to the nitty-gritty of practice.
Exactly. And this is where this idea of deliberate practice comes in, which is something that Natu talks about extensively in the 1 Hour Guide.
Okay.
And deliberate practice, as opposed to just kind of mindless repetition,
Yeah.
is really about being very intentional with your effort.
Okay, so it's not just about putting in the hours.
It's not just about clocking in.
Right.
It's about how can I squeeze the most value out of every minute of practice.
Yeah, yeah. So give me an example of what that might look like.
So think of it like an athlete training for the Olympics, right? They don't just go to the gym and randomly lift weights or run around.
Right.
Their entire workout is tailored to target very specific areas, very specific weaknesses that they're trying to improve.
So it's about being very focused on, okay, this is the area and I need to work on.
Yes.
I'm going to put all my energy and attention into that.
And being willing to push beyond your comfort zone, right?
Yeah.
Because that's where the real growth happens.
Right. And I guess being willing to seek feedback, right?
Absolutely.
Because sometimes we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
And we need someone else to kind of point out those blind spots.
Absolutely. And Nathu shares this great example in the 1 Hour Guide about a computer science professor who used deliberate practice to ace his discrete mathematics course.
Really?
Yeah. Instead of just doing endless practice problems, he'd really analyze his mistakes, figure out why he was getting things wrong, and then target those weak areas in his practice sessions.
Okay, so even at that level, even someone who's, presumably very intelligent, still needs to be very strategic.
Absolutely.
About the way they're practicing.
And I think that's encouraging, right? Because it means that even if we're struggling initially, we're not doomed to mediocrity.
Yeah.
If we approach it the right way with that deliberate mindset, we can make significant progress.
Okay, so that's great, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that, kind of brings me back down to earth is like, okay, well, I'm busy.
Right.
How do I fit all this into my already jam-packed schedule?
Yeah, and that's where I think the 1 Hour Guide's emphasis on techniques like interleaving and space repetition comes in.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard of space repetition.
Yeah.
That's all about kind of, reviewing things at strategic intervals to kind of help cement them in memory.
Exactly, yeah. It's playing with the forgetting curve.
Right.
And making sure that you're reviewing information right before you're about to forget it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so that makes sense. But what's this interleaving thing?
So Interleaving is a little bit more unconventional, but it's essentially like cross-training for your brain.
Nope.
So instead of practicing one skill for hours on end, you're actually switching between different but related skills during your practice sessions.
Okay, so like, I don't know, if I'm learning Spanish,
Yeah.
instead of just doing vocab for an hour,
Right.
I might do vocab for 15 minutes, then do some grammar for 15 minutes, then listen to a podcast or something.
Exactly.
Okay, and why is that beneficial?
Well, a couple of reasons.
Yeah.
One is it just keeps things more interesting, right? It prevents you from getting bored and zoning out.
Yeah.
But more importantly, it forces your brain to work harder
Oh, yeah.
because you're constantly having to switch gears, you're having to recall information from different contexts,
Right.
and that leads to much better retention in the long run.
Okay, so it's almost like it's like weightlifting for your brain.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you're kind of shocking it into growth.
You're keeping it on its toes.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and you can apply this to so many different skills.
Yeah.
You know, if you're a musician,
Right.
you can practice different scales, different keys, different techniques.
Okay, yeah. I can see that.
If you're studying for an exam, you can switch between different subjects
Mm-hmm.
rather than just cramming one topic at a time.
Right. And it's almost like you're making connections between those things as well.
Exactly, and that's what leads to that deeper understanding.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we're starting to get into some really interesting territory here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm excited to dig even deeper into this in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, me too.
So we'll see you back here soon.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to our deep dive into rapid skill acquisition with Anil Nathu's 1-Hour Guide. You know, in the last part, we were talking about choosing skills strategically.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking about all the things I've learned over the years that I didn't think would be that useful. But they've actually kind of come in handy in unexpected ways.
That's the beauty of compound utility, isn't it? It's like you're investing in skills that pay dividends in multiple areas of your life.
Yeah, totally. Like, I used to be really into photography, like, years ago.
Uh-huh.
And I never really pursued it professionally, but all that stuff about composition and lighting and framing, it actually helps me now when I'm creating content, even if it's just like a simple social media post or something.
Exactly. Those skills transfer, right. And that's a perfect example of what Anil Nathu is talking about in the 1-Hour Guide. It's not always about mastering one specific skill to become like the world expert in that thing.
Right.
It's about how those skills can kind of bleed over and enhance other areas of your life.
It's like they become building blocks for other skills.
Yeah.
Which actually leads me to something else I wanted to ask you about, this idea of skill stacking.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. That was popularized by Scott Adams, right? The Dilbert guy.
Yeah. He's got some interesting ideas about success and how it's not always about being like the absolute best at one thing.
Right. His argument is that being pretty good at a few different skills, but the right combination of skills, can actually make you way more valuable than being like a world-class expert in just one thing.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's not just about having a bunch of random skills, it's about stacking them strategically.
Exactly. Like, let's say you're a decent writer.
Okay.
You have some basic marketing know-how, and you can build a simple website. Suddenly, you're a one-person content creation machine.
Yeah. You can do it all yourself. You don't have to rely on anyone else.
Right. You're not necessarily a master in any one of those areas, but combined, those skills make you a force to be reckoned with.
That's so cool. Okay, so we've got this idea of compound utility and skill stacking. But at the end of the day, we still need to put in the work, right? Like, we need to actually learn these skills.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where the rubber meets the road. And you know, one thing Anil Nathu really hammers home in the 1-Hour Guide is the importance of habits.
Ooh, habits. Yeah, that's where I struggle sometimes.
Yeah, we all do. But think about it this way. It's not about relying on motivation because motivation comes and goes.
Right. Some days you're fired up and ready to go, and other days you're like, nope, not happening.
Exactly. So instead of relying on willpower, what if you designed your environment to make it easier to stick to those good habits?
Okay, I like where this is going. So, like, what would that look like? Give me an example.
Well, let's say you're trying to learn Spanish.
Okay.
What if you put your Spanish textbook right next to your coffee maker?
Oh, so I can't miss it in the morning.
Exactly. You're
Right.
making it harder to ignore. Or what if you leave your guitar out in the living room instead of tucked away in a case?
Oh, yeah. Out of sight, out of mind, right?
Totally. Little things like that can make a big difference. You're basically setting yourself up for success by reducing the friction to actually do the thing.
I love that. Reduce the friction. And you know what? While we're on the topic of environment, something I've noticed is how much my physical space impacts my ability to focus and learn.
Oh, 100%. And Neil Natsu talks about this too. It's about designing your environment for good decisions.
I love that phrase. So for me, it's like if my workspace is cluttered, my brain feels cluttered too. But when everything's neat and organized, I feel like I can actually think straight.
Right. It's like you're creating a mental space for clarity and focus. And it's not just about clutter, it's about minimizing distractions too.
Yeah, like turning off your phone notifications, maybe putting on some noise-canceling headphones.
Exactly. You're trying to create an environment that's conducive to learning.
Okay, so we've got our environment dialed in. We're practicing deliberately. What else do we need to keep in mind?
Well, one thing that's absolutely crucial, and Anil Nathu dedicates a whole chapter to this in the 1 Hour Guide, is feedback.
Oh, feedback. Yeah, that can be tough sometimes, especially when it's not, glowing praise.
Right, but even if it's not what you want to hear, it's so valuable for growth.
Yeah, so how do we make the most of feedback? Like, what are some tips for receiving it in a way that's actually helpful?
Well, first of all, don't wait for it to come to you. Seek it out. Ask for it from people you trust, mentors, peers, even online communities. And when you do get feedback, try not to get defensive.
Okay, yeah, it's easy to take it personally, but it's not about you as a person. It's about the work.
Exactly. And focus on the specific suggestions for improvement. Like, okay, maybe my presentation skills need work, or maybe my writing isn't as clear as it could be.
Right, it's about separating our ego from the process.
Exactly. And another thing that often gets overlooked when we're talking about skill acquisition is the importance of rest and recovery.
Hold on. Are you telling me that taking breaks can actually make me learn faster?
I am. It might seem counterintuitive, but sleep is absolutely crucial for memory consolidation.
Okay, so it's not just about cramming as much information into your brain as possible. It's also about letting your brain process that information.
Exactly. When you sleep, your brain is busy making connections, strengthening those neural pathways. Skimping on sleep is like sabotaging your own efforts.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I guess I'm not doing myself any favors by pulling all-nighters.
Probably not. And speaking of things that aren't doing us any favors, let's talk about procrastination.
Ooh, yeah. Procrastination. The bane of my existence. I'm the queen of putting things off until the last minute.
We all have our struggles, but the good news is there are strategies to overcome it. And Anil Nathu outlines some really practical ones in the 1 Hour Guide.
Okay, so give me some of the highlights. What are some things we could do to beat procrastination?
Well, one thing is breaking down those big, overwhelming tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's less daunting that way.
Right. And then set deadlines for yourself,
All
even
right.
if they're self-imposed. Sometimes having that external pressure can be helpful.
Yeah, I work better under pressure, for sure.
Yeah.
Like if I know something's due tomorrow, I'll actually get it done. But if it's like, oh, I can do that anytime, it'll probably never happen.
Exactly. Another thing you can try is finding an accountability partner, someone who can check in with you and make sure you're staying on track.
Oh yeah, having someone to answer to can definitely help. Okay, so we're breaking things down, setting deadlines, finding an accountability buddy. What about the fear of failure? That can be a big obstacle too.
Oh, absolutely. It can be paralyzing, but Anil Nathu suggests a powerful mindset shift that can help.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the secret?
He says to view failure not as a sign of inadequacy, but as a necessary part of the learning process.
Oh, okay. So it's not about avoiding failure, it's about embracing it.
Exactly. Each mistake is a chance to learn and improve. And, that ties in nicely with what we were talking about earlier with the growth mindset.
Right, it's that belief that we can always get better with effort.
Exactly. And speaking of getting better, another fascinating topic that the 1 Hour Guide delves into is optimizing memory.
Okay, memory. That's something I struggle with too. I feel like I have the memory of a goldfish sometimes.
But here's the thing, we tend to think of memory as this fixed capacity, like some people have good memories and some people don't.
Right, like it's genetic or something.
But Anil Nathu argues that memory is a skill that can be trained.
Really? So even if I feel like I have a terrible memory, I can still improve it.
Absolutely. He suggests using mnemonic devices, things like acronyms or rhymes, to help you remember information.
Oh yeah, like ROYGBY for the colors of rainbow.
Exactly. And spaced repetition, which we talked about earlier, is also super helpful for memory. And something called active recall is incredibly powerful.
Active recall, what's that?
Instead of just passively rereading your notes, you actually try to recall the information from memory. Test yourself, quiz yourself. This forces your brain to work harder, and it strengthens those memory pathways.
That's fascinating. It's like giving your memory a workout. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about habits, environment, feedback, overcoming procrastination and the fear of failure, even optimizing memory. It's a lot to take in.
It is, and it can feel a bit overwhelming. But that's why, at the end of the day, Anil Nathu emphasizes the importance of having a purpose for learning.
Right, it's not just about learning for the sake of learning. It's about connecting it to something that matters to you.
Exactly. Whether it's a career goal, a personal passion, or just the desire to understand the world better, having a purpose fuels your motivation and helps you stick with it even when things get tough.
That makes so much sense. It's like if you know why you're doing something, it's easier to stay committed.
Exactly. And with that clear purpose in mind, you can then start to implement all these amazing strategies that we've been talking about.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I'm already thinking about how I can apply all this to my own learning goals.
And we're not done yet. There's even more to uncover in the science of rapid skill acquisition. Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive, and we're going to be wrapping things up here talking about rapid skill acquisition with Anil Nathu's 1-hour guide.
Yeah, I'm excited for this last part because there are a couple of things that Nathu brings up that I think a lot of people don't really consider when they're thinking about learning. Oh, okay. Intrigue me. What are we talking about?
Well, one of them is visualization,
Okay.
and the other is creativity.
Interesting. Okay, so visualization first. I've heard athletes talk about this, like picturing themselves making that winning shot or whatever.
Right.
But how does that actually apply to like learning a new skill?
Well, Nathu's point is that visualization is essentially a form of mental rehearsal.
Okay.
So when you vividly imagine yourself performing a skill successfully, you're actually creating neural pathways in your brain.
Really?
Almost like you're actually doing it in the real world.
So it's not just like some kind of woo-woo like self-help thing.
No, there's actually some science behind it.
Okay, so give me an example.
Okay, so let's say you're trying to learn a new language.
Yeah.
Instead of just memorizing verb conjugations or vocabulary lists,
Right.
spend some time actually visualizing yourself having a fluent conversation in that language.
Okay.
Imagine what it feels like, what you're seeing, what you're hearing. So really try and make it as vivid and as real as possible.
Exactly.
And that somehow helps to kind of lay down those neural pathways.
Yeah, and the more detail you can add to that visualization, the more effective it's going to be.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think it also helps with confidence, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
If you can already see yourself succeeding in your mind,
Right.
it's not as scary to actually go out and try it in the real world.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
And, studies have shown that visualization can actually improve performance in a wide range of skills, not just sports.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
It really is.
I mean, it just goes to show you how much potential we have that we're not even tapping into.
Absolutely. And that actually brings us to this other point that I wanted to touch on, which is creativity.
Okay.
Now, we often think of creativity as something you're either born with or you're not.
Right. Like some people are just naturally creative.
Right. But Nathu's argument is that creativity is a skill that can be developed.
Okay, so you're telling me that even if I don't consider myself a creative type,
Yeah.
I can still learn to think more creatively.
Absolutely. It's about challenging your assumptions, exploring different perspectives,
Okay.
playing with ideas, experimenting, even embracing mistakes as part of the creative process.
So it's not about being afraid to try new things and to potentially fail.
Exactly. Failure is part of the process.
Yeah, okay, so we're getting back to that growth mindset idea.
It all ties together.
Right, it's all connected.
Right. And I think the key takeaway here is that we have more control over our learning and our creativity than we think.
Yeah, that's empowering.
It is. But here's the thing. All this knowledge, all these strategies, they're useless unless we actually put them into action.
Right, it's like reading a cookbook and never cooking a meal.
Exactly. And Nathu is very clear about this in the 1-hour guide.
Yeah.
Taking action is the bridge between knowledge and mastery.
Yeah, so I guess the question is, where do we even begin?
Well, Nathu's advice is to start small. Don't try to do everything at once.
Right.
Set a tiny goal, something so ridiculously easy that you can't possibly fail.
Okay, like what?
Like instead of saying, I'm going to learn Spanish, say, I'm going to learn 5 new Spanish words today.
Okay, yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, that feels much more manageable.
Right. And it creates momentum.
Right, and then you could build on that.
Exactly. And as you start to experience those small wins, it motivates you to keep going.
Yeah, it's like that snowball effect.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, this has been such a fascinating conversation, and I honestly feel like I have a whole new toolkit now for approaching skill acquisition.
Me too. Nathu's one-hour guide is really packed with valuable insights.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anyone listening who's ready to kind of take their learning to the next level, we highly recommend checking out The Science of Rapid Skill Acquisition.
Absolutely. And don't forget to visit the One-Hour Diet website for more great insights from Anil Nathu.
Yes, definitely check that out. And thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the world of rapid skill acquisition.
It's been a pleasure.